At my mother's 70th birthday, she acted like a loving parent just to get my inheritance. I smiled, opened my black briefcase, and handed out the custody papers they signed 20 years ago. When my father read the proof, his face went pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Natalie. I'm 41 years old, and until that afternoon, I hadn't stepped into a family gathering since I was 13. Some people spend years wondering what they'd say if they ever saw their family again. I spent years deciding what I wouldn't say. The country club looked exactly like the kind of place my mother always dreamed of for a milestone birthday. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, a string quartet playing softly, waiters carrying champagne. From the parking lot, I could already hear laughter. For a second, I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel. Then I picked up the black briefcase from the passenger seat. It wasn't expensive, plain leather, no fancy logo, but I held it like it weighed 100 pounds. Because what was inside mattered far more than how it looked. I walked toward the entrance. The hostess smiled politely. "Welcome, family of Susan Carter?" I nodded. Before I reached the center of the room, conversation started slowing down. One table noticed me, then another. Soon, almost everyone had turned to look. 20 years is a long time. Long enough for memories to become stories. Long enough for people to believe those stories without questioning them. My mother spotted me first. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face, then it vanished. "Natalie." She hurried over with both arms open. Before I could react, she hugged me. "Oh my goodness. Look at you." I didn't hug her back. I simply stood there until she let go. "You came," she said softly. "I did. I wasn't sure you would." "I know." She looked at me as if searching for the 13-year-old she'd last seen. "You look wonderful." "Thank you." Her eyes drifted to the briefcase. "Working today?" "You could say that." She laughed, though I wasn't joking. People nearby relaxed. Someone whispered, "See? I told you she'd come around eventually." Another added, "It's about time." I pretended not to hear them. My father approached more slowly. Richard Carter had more gray hair, but everything else felt familiar. The careful smile, the measured handshake. "Natalie." "Dad." "It's good to see you." "You too." Neither of us moved closer. He cleared his throat. "Your mother has been hoping you'd come." I nodded. "So," he tried again. "How have you been?" "Busy." "I heard you're doing well." "I am." The silence became awkward until one of my cousins interrupted. "Natalie, I almost didn't recognize you." She hugged me before I could respond. Others followed. Aunts, uncles, second cousins. Some looked happy, some looked curious. Others stared like they'd only heard stories about me. Then I noticed something. Nobody asked why I'd stayed away. Instead, they asked questions that assumed they already knew. "So, are you finally ready to reconnect? It takes courage to come back. Your mother always said she'd leave the door open." Every sentence carried the same assumption. That I had walked away? I smiled politely. "It's been a long time. Life gets busy. I'm glad everyone seems well." Safe answers, not lies, just not the whole truth. Eventually, I found a chair near the edge of the room. I placed the black briefcase beside me. My mother moved from table to table, laughing and accepting compliments like the perfect parent. Every few minutes, she'd glance at me. Across the room, I caught my father's eyes. He looked away first. Then, an older uncle sat beside me. He smiled warmly. "Well, does this mean you're finally home for good?" I looked at him, then at my mother, who had quietly stopped talking just long enough to hear my answer. I rested one hand on the black briefcase. "No," I said calmly. "I'm only here for one reason. The room went quiet for a second. Then my uncle laughed awkwardly. "Well," he said, patting my shoulder, "I'm just glad you're here." "So am I," I answered. It wasn't a lie. I was exactly where I needed to be. He nodded, stood up, and wandered toward another table, probably relieved the conversation hadn't turned uncomfortable. It didn't take long before someone else filled the empty chair. My Aunt Linda leaned over with the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to fix something they don't fully understand. "Natalie," she said, touching my arm, "your mother never stopped talking about you." I gave her a polite smile. "Is that so?" "Oh, absolutely. She always hoped you'd come back one day." There was no accusation in her voice. She genuinely believed it. That was the strange part. Nobody sounded like they were lying. They sounded like people repeating a story they'd heard so many times it had become the truth. Another cousin joined us. "I remember everyone saying you wanted to travel." Before I could answer, Aunt Linda frowned. "No, that's not right." Natalie moved away because she wanted a fresh start. A man across the table shook his head. "I thought she left after fighting with Richard." His wife looked surprised. "I heard she got accepted into a school across the country." For a moment, they all looked at each other. Everyone had a different version. No one seemed to notice. I sat there quietly, listening as they tried to piece together my life using stories that didn't even match. It almost would have been funny if it hadn't been my life they were talking about. "So," my cousin asked, "which one is true?" I picked up my glass of water. "None of those." The table fell silent. "Oh." Nobody pushed for details. Instead, someone quickly changed the subject: the birthday cake, vacation plans, a grandson starting college. The conversation flowed again as if nothing unusual had happened. I realized something else. People weren't avoiding the truth because they were cruel. Most of them honestly didn't know it. Across the room, my mother laughed loudly as another guest complimented the decorations. She accepted every compliment with effortless grace. Watching her, you'd think she'd spent the last 20 years raising a close-knit family. A waiter stopped beside me. "Would you like some champagne?" "Just sparkling water, thanks." He smiled and moved on. Little moments like that gave me a chance to breathe. Daniel always used to tell me that when a room became overwhelming, I should focus on ordinary things for a minute. The sound of glasses, someone laughing, music in the background. It helped. Not because it erased the tension, because it reminded me I didn't have to react to every uncomfortable moment. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "Natalie?" I looked up. It was my mother's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Jensen. She had aged, but her gentle smile hadn't changed. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "Your mother worried about you for years." I searched her face. She meant every word. "I'm glad she's not worried anymore." Mrs. Jensen smiled with obvious relief. "So you two finally worked everything out?" I hesitated just long enough to avoid lying. "We're talking." "That's wonderful." She squeezed my hand before walking away. I watched her disappear into the crowd. Another person who had only seen one side of the story. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. And I'd love to know if you've ever discovered your family believed something about you that wasn't true. When I looked around again, I started noticing small things I'd missed earlier. My father stayed close to guests but never too close to me. Whenever someone glanced in my direction, he'd suddenly find another conversation to join. My mother was the opposite. She kept mentioning my name. "Our Natalie made it. I'm so happy she's here. It means everything to me." Each sentence earned sympathetic smiles. She was building a picture, one where the missing daughter had finally come home. Then I noticed someone who hadn't said a single word all afternoon. Claire. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't smiling for photos. She stood near one of the windows with a glass in her hand, watching the room. Watching me. Every time someone approached her, she'd answer politely, then her eyes drifted back in my direction. Not angry, not welcoming, just studying me, like she was trying to recognize someone she hadn't seen in 20 years. Neither of us moved. Neither of us waved. Across a crowded room filled with family, my sister and I simply looked at each other in silence. Claire looked away first. A second later, my mother's cheerful voice cut through the room. "There you are, Natalie." She walked toward me carrying the same bright smile she'd been wearing all afternoon. Without asking, she slipped her arm through mine. "Come with me. There are people you've never met." I let her lead me across the room. It wasn't worth resisting. Besides, I wanted to see how she introduced me. We stopped beside a table filled with younger relatives. Some were in their 20s. A few were teenagers. Most of them had only known me through family stories. Susan beamed. "Everyone, this is my daughter Natalie." A young woman stood first. "I'm Emily. I don't think we've ever met." "We haven't," I said with a smile. "It's nice to finally meet you." "You too." Another cousin laughed. "I honestly thought you lived overseas." Someone else chimed in. "I heard you traveled for work all the time." A younger guy shrugged. "My mom said you just needed space." They all laughed lightly. Not because they were mocking me, because they thought they were talking about harmless family history. My mother gave a little sigh. "Natalie has always done things her own way." She squeezed my arm gently. "But family always has a way of finding each other again." Several heads nodded. I noticed the expressions around the table. No one questioned her. Why would they? Most of them had grown up hearing the same version every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday I never attended. One of the younger cousins looked at me with genuine curiosity. "So, what made you come back now?" For a split second, the room became very quiet. Susan answered before I could. "Sometimes people simply realize what matters most." She smiled at me as though inviting me to agree. I returned a small smile. "It's been a long time." That was all I said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't an argument either. The conversation moved on. Someone talked about college. Another cousin showed vacation photos on his phone. Emily asked what I did for a living. "I'm a construction safety inspector." Her eyebrows lifted. "Really? That sounds stressful." "It can be." "So you're the person who tells everyone what they're doing wrong?" I laughed softly. "Only when they're actually doing something dangerous." The table laughed with me. For the first time since arriving, the tension eased. Just a little. It reminded me that not everyone in this room was my enemy. Most of them were simply missing pieces of the story. A teenage cousin leaned closer. "I think it's kind of cool." "What is?" "Starting over somewhere else?" I looked at him. "What makes you think I started over?" He blinked. "I mean, everyone always said you left because you wanted a different life." There it was again. Another version. Another story that had settled into the family like it was fact. I smiled politely. "I do have a different life." He grinned. "See? I knew it." I didn't correct him. Not yet. Across the room, waiters began serving dinner. People drifted toward their assigned tables. The room filled with conversations about work, children, vacations, and retirement plans. Ordinary family talk. I found my seat and placed the black briefcase beside my chair again. Every now and then someone would glance at it. Nobody asked what was inside. Not yet. My mother stood to welcome everyone. She thanked friends for coming. She thanked relatives for supporting the family through the years. Then she looked toward me. "And having Natalie here today," she said warmly, "is the greatest birthday gift I could have asked for." The room erupted in applause. Some people even looked at me with watery eyes. I smiled politely. Nothing more. When the applause faded, conversations picked up again. I reached for my glass of water and happened to glance toward my father. One of my uncles had asked him something. I couldn't hear the question. Then I caught a single word. Childhood. It was enough. My father's smile disappeared for the briefest moment. He answered quickly. Too quickly. Then, almost instinctively, he looked across the room. Our eyes nearly met. Instead, he lowered his gaze to his plate and busied himself unfolding his napkin as if it suddenly required his full attention. That was the first time all afternoon. I noticed my father avoiding eye contact every time our childhood came up. Watching my father avoid that simple conversation pulled me back to memories I hadn't visited in years. People often ask whether children notice favoritism. They do. They just don't have the words for it. When Claire and I were little, our house never felt openly unfair. It was much quieter than that. Claire was the child everyone planned for. I was the child everyone assumed would figure things out. I remember sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while Mom helped Claire practice for a spelling competition. Again, Mom said patiently. Claire sighed dramatically. I already know this one. I know you do, Mom laughed, but you can always get better. I kept working through my math assignment. A few minutes later, I raised my hand almost like I was in school. Mom? 1 second, honey. Another word. Another correction. Another encouraging smile for Claire. Eventually, Mom looked at me. What is it? I don't understand this problem. She barely glanced at the page. You'll figure it out. Then she turned back to Claire. At 13, that didn't sound cruel. It almost sounded like a compliment. You'll figure it out. I heard those words all the time. Dad used them too. Claire needed help. I needed opportunities. Claire deserved guidance. I was independent. At least that's what everyone called it. Whenever relatives visited, they'd compare us without realizing it. Claire is such a natural leader. Natalie's so independent. Claire has big dreams. Natalie doesn't need much attention. People smiled every time they said it, like independence was a gift. Maybe it is, just not when it's handed to a child who never had a choice. There were little moments I didn't understand until I was older. Claire got driven to piano lessons every Tuesday. I rode my bike to the library because no one was available. Claire and Dad spent Saturday mornings visiting colleges even before high school. Victor, my uncle, taught me how to repair broken fence posts because I happened to be around when he visited. Nobody ever announced those decisions. They simply happened. And after a while, they became normal. Claire never acted spoiled. That's important. She wasn't mean to me. If anything, she often invited me to join whatever she was doing. Want to practice with me? She'd ask. Sometimes I did. Sometimes Mom would smile. No, sweetheart, Natalie has her own things. My own things. That phrase followed me everywhere. One afternoon I came home carrying a science project I'd spent weeks building. It wasn't perfect, but I was proud of it. Dad looked up from reading the newspaper. Looks good. Then Claire walked in holding a report card. Straight A's. Dad stood immediately. That's incredible. Mom hugged her. They talked about celebrating over dinner. I quietly carried my project upstairs. No one told me to. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Looking back, I don't think my parents hated me. That's what made everything so confusing. They simply invested their energy differently. Claire was treated like the family's future. I was treated like someone who could manage without extra attention. Children notice those differences long before adults admit they exist. As the years passed, little comments started changing. Not about us, about money. Dad stopped talking about vacations. Mom started clipping coupons at the kitchen table. Phone calls became quieter. Bills disappeared into drawers whenever Claire or I walked into the room. One evening, I came downstairs for a glass of water. My parents didn't know I was standing in the hallway. We can't keep doing this, Mom whispered. I know, Dad answered. We're running out of options. The house felt different after that. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, but the little comforts started disappearing. The new car was gone, vacations were canceled. Even birthday celebrations became smaller. For the first time, I realized our family wasn't just stressed. We were in real financial trouble. And judging by the look on my parents' faces, they hadn't figured out what they were going to do next. Money became the topic that ended every conversation. If Claire or I walked into the room, voices dropped. If the phone rang, Dad answered it outside. If someone knocked on the front door, Mom peeked through the curtains before opening it. I didn't understand what was happening. I only knew our house felt smaller every week. One Saturday morning, I found Mom sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by envelopes. She quickly stacked them together when she saw me. Morning, sweetheart. Morning? You hungry? A little. She forced a smile. I'll make pancakes. We don't have pancake mix anymore, I said without thinking. She paused. Then she smiled again, a little tighter this time. I'll figure something out. That phrase sounded familiar. Everyone in the family was trying to figure something out. Dad started working later into the evenings. Sometimes he came home too tired to eat. Other nights, he barely spoke. Claire kept asking if everything was okay. Dad always gave the same answer. Just work. I stopped asking. One evening, I heard raised voices coming from my parents' bedroom, not yelling. The kind of conversation people have when they're trying very hard not to wake the kids. We can't afford both, Mom whispered sharply. I know. There has to be another option. I've called everyone. I shouldn't have listened, but I couldn't make myself walk away. Then I heard a name. Victor. The room went quiet. A few seconds later, Dad spoke again. He already offered. Mom didn't answer right away. Finally, she sighed. It would only be temporary. Temporary. That was the first word I understood. The next afternoon, Uncle Victor came over. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He wore dusty work boots, smelled like fresh hay, and somehow always looked calm no matter what was happening. He and Dad spent nearly an hour in the garage. When they came inside, nobody looked at each other. At dinner, Claire talked about school. Mom smiled when she needed to. Dad barely touched his food. Finally, he set his fork down. Natalie. I looked up. We've been thinking. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Your Uncle Victor could really use some help out at the farm for a while. I blinked. The farm? It'll be good for you, Dad added quickly. You've always loved being outdoors. That part was true. Victor's horse farm had always been my favorite place to visit. I looked at Claire. She looked just as confused as I felt. How long? I asked. Mom squeezed my hand. Oh, not very long. Dad nodded. Just until we get things sorted out. A few months, Mom said. Maybe less. I remember feeling relieved. A few months didn't sound scary. It almost sounded like an adventure. I'd spend the summer helping Uncle Victor. I'd come back before school really got busy. Everything would be normal again. Claire smiled. I'm going to miss you. All right. You better. We both laughed. For the first time in weeks, dinner felt almost normal. Even my parents seemed lighter, as though simply making a decision had taken a weight off their shoulders. That evening, Mom helped me fold clothes into an old suitcase. She kept finding reasons to add extra things. Another sweater, an extra pair of jeans. My favorite book. You won't need all this if it's only a few months, I joked. She stopped folding for a second. Then she smiled without looking at me. I just want you to have everything you need. Before bed, Dad knocked softly on my bedroom door. He wasn't usually the type for long conversations. He sat on the edge of the bed. This isn't goodbye. I know. We're going to come see you. I know. And when things settle down, He paused. "We'll bring you home." I believed him. Completely. Because when you're 13, you don't expect your parents to promise something they don't intend to keep. Before he turned off the light, Dad smiled. "It won't be long, kiddo." Mom appeared in the doorway beside him. "We'll come back for you soon." I smiled and nodded. Those were the last words both of my parents said to me before I left with Uncle Victor. The drive to Uncle Victor's farm took a little over 3 hours. At first, I kept talking. I pointed out roadside diners, old barns, and every horse trailer that passed us. Victor smiled now and then, but he wasn't much of a talker. Every so often, he'd ask, "You doing okay?" I'd nod. "I'm fine." The truth was, I wasn't sad yet. I was still thinking about what Mom had said. A few months? I could handle a few months. When we turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm, the world felt different. The noise of traffic disappeared. There were wide open fields, white fences, and horses grazing in the distance. "It smells different," I said. Victor chuckled. "That's farm life." Helen was already waiting on the porch. She walked down the steps before the truck even stopped. "There she is." She hugged me gently. "We're so happy you're here." It wasn't the kind of hug that demanded anything. It simply made space for me. She carried one of my bags inside before I had the chance. "Come on," she said. "Let's show you your room." I expected a guest room. Instead, she opened the door to a bedroom that looked lived in. Fresh curtains, a bookshelf, a desk by the window, even a small lamp beside the bed. I looked around slowly. "You already had this?" Helen smiled at Victor. "He started fixing it up the day your parents called." Victor rubbed the back of his neck. "Figured you'd need your own space." I ran my hand across the desk. Nothing expensive, nothing fancy. But someone had spent time getting the room ready. That caught me off guard. That evening, we ate dinner together in the kitchen. No television, no rushed conversation. Helen asked about school. Victor asked whether I liked horses. "I've only ridden a couple of times." "We'll fix that," he said. It was the longest sentence I'd heard him say all day. Helen laughed. "Don't worry. He says that to everyone." For the first time since leaving home, I laughed too. The next morning started earlier than I was used to. Victor knocked lightly on my door. "Breakfast in 10. When I came downstairs, everyone was already awake. No one seemed rushed. After breakfast, Victor showed me around the farm. He introduced me to each horse by name as if they were neighbors. I forgot every single name within minutes. He pretended not to notice. "You'll learn." That became another phrase I heard often. "You'll learn." Unlike the words I'd heard at home, these weren't meant to leave me alone. They came with patience. If I didn't know how to do something, Victor showed me. Then he watched while I tried. If I made a mistake, he corrected it without making me feel foolish. Helen had her own quiet routines. She packed lunches, asked how school registration was going, made sure I knew where the extra blankets were. Little things, nothing dramatic. But every small gesture made the house feel a little less unfamiliar. The hardest part wasn't the farm. It was nighttime. I'd sit on the edge of my bed looking at the small clock beside the lamp. Around that time, Mom and Dad would usually be finishing dinner back home. I'd imagine what they were doing. Whether Claire had started school shopping, whether anyone had noticed my room was empty. I almost picked up the phone more than once. Then I'd stop myself. Dad said they'd call. Mom promised they'd visit. There was no reason to worry. A few days turned into a week. School started. My teachers were kind. The students were curious about the new girl from another town. Life slowly settled into a routine. Feed the horses before school, classes, homework, dinner, sleep. One evening, Helen looked up from washing dishes. "Have your parents called today?" I looked toward the kitchen phone. Not today. She nodded. I'm sure they're busy getting everything sorted out. Yeah, I believe that. At least I wanted to. Another week passed. Then another. Every afternoon, I'd glance at the phone when I walked into the house. Sometimes I'd even ask Victor before taking off my backpack. Any calls? He'd give me the same gentle answer. Not today. Eventually, I stopped asking every day, but I never stopped listening, hoping that one afternoon, the phone would finally ring for me. Saturday became my favorite day. Not because there wasn't any school, because I was convinced that if Mom and Dad were going to visit, it would be on a weekend. Every Saturday morning, I'd wake up earlier than everyone else. I'd brush my hair, put on clean clothes, and sit on the front porch with a book I barely read. Every time I heard an engine in the distance, I'd look up. Most of the time, it was a delivery truck. Sometimes it was a neighbor. Sometimes it was nobody coming to the farm at all. Victor noticed. He never mentioned it at first. Instead, he'd walk outside carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and 1 mug of hot chocolate for me. Got a busy day planned, he'd say. What are we doing? Fence needs fixing. Or, one of the horses lost a shoe. Or, I could use another pair of hands. I always went with him. Not because fences were exciting, because staying busy made the waiting easier. Victor had a quiet way of helping people. He never said, "Stop thinking about your parents." He simply gave me something else to think about. One afternoon we were repairing a broken gate. He handed me a hammer. "You've been checking that mailbox every day." I froze for a second. I didn't think anyone noticed. I notice most things. I looked toward the road. I keep thinking maybe a letter got delayed. He nodded slowly. Maybe. That was all he said. No false promises, no speeches, just one honest word. Maybe. Every afternoon after school, I'd still stop at the mailbox before walking into the house. Usually it held advertisements, farm supply catalogs, electric bills. Sometimes nothing at all. Helen pretended she needed the mail too. "I'll come with you," she'd say. I knew she wasn't interested in utility bills. She just didn't want me making that walk alone. One evening, while we were making dinner together, she casually asked, "Have you thought about calling home?" "I have. But I don't want them to think I don't trust what they said." She looked at me for a long moment. "I understand." Then she changed the subject. Looking back, I think she understood more than I realized. Fall settled over the farm. The mornings grew colder. The horse's breath drifted through the air like little clouds. School became familiar. I even made a couple of friends. For a few hours each day, life almost felt normal. Then I'd come home, see the mailbox, and remember. Claire called once. Just once. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She mostly talked about school, a teacher we both liked, a math test she'd almost failed. Before hanging up, she said, "Mom and Dad have been really busy." "I know. They said things should get better soon." "I know." Neither of us knew what else to say. When the call ended, I smiled anyway. At least I'd heard a familiar voice. Weeks slipped into months without me realizing it. The calendar kept moving. The phone stayed quiet. One morning, Helen asked what kind of birthday cake I wanted. I hadn't even remembered my birthday was coming. "Anything's fine." Victor overheard us. "No," he said. "Birthday cake isn't an anything's fine situation." Helen laughed. "We'll make your favorite." The 3 of us spent that evening in the kitchen. The cake leaned slightly to one side. The frosting wasn't perfect. Victor sang completely off-key. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. For a little while, I forgot to look toward the driveway. After dinner, Helen handed me a small wrapped package. Victor gave me a paperback book about horses. Simple gifts, thoughtful gifts. The kind people choose when they've been paying attention. I thanked them both. Then, almost without thinking, I glanced at the phone sitting on the kitchen counter. It never rang. Before going to bed, I checked the mailbox one last time with a flashlight. Empty. No birthday card, no letter. No note from my parents. Nothing at all. Life on the farm didn't suddenly become easy, it just became familiar. Without realizing it, I stopped counting the weeks. School assignments replaced calendar dates. Chores filled the afternoons. By the time I finished homework every night, I was usually too tired to wonder whether tomorrow would finally be the day my parents called. Helen never tried to replace my mother. I think that's why she slowly became the person I trusted most. She'd ask simple questions while we cooked dinner. "How'd your history test go?" "Pretty good." "Pretty good means what?" I smiled. 94. She grinned like I'd won an award. "I knew you could do it." No speeches, no comparison to anyone else, just quiet encouragement. One Saturday, she taught me how to make homemade bread. Mine came out uneven and lopsided. I looked at it and laughed. "It looks terrible." "It looks homemade," Helen corrected. Victor walked into the kitchen, cut off a piece before it had even cooled, and nodded. "Tastes fine to me." That became the rhythm of the house. Nobody expected perfection. They just expected honesty and effort. The farm had its own routines, too. Every horse had a personality. Some were stubborn, some demanded attention. One old mare refused to cooperate unless I talked to her while brushing her. Victor watched me one morning and smiled. "Looks like she picked you." I thought people picked horses. Not always. I wasn't sure whether he was talking about the horse anymore. At school, things slowly changed too. Teachers stopped introducing me as the new student. Friends started inviting me to football games and birthday parties. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the girl waiting for someone. I was just Natalie. One afternoon, I came running into the house carrying a paper from school. "Helen!" She looked up from folding laundry. "What happened?" "I made the honor roll." Her face lit up immediately. I knew it. She hugged me before taking the paper to read every word. Victor came inside a few minutes later and she practically waved the certificate in his face. "Look what she did." He smiled at me. "Nice work, kiddo." That evening we celebrated with hamburgers from the little diner 20 minutes away. Nothing fancy, but it felt special. Driving home, I caught myself thinking, I can't wait to tell Helen about my next report card. The thought surprised me, not because I'd said Helen, because I hadn't thought about calling home first. That realization sat quietly with me for days. Whenever something good happened, my feet naturally carried me toward Helen. When I needed advice about school, I asked Helen. When I wasn't feeling well, Helen was the one knocking on my bedroom door with soup. I felt guilty every time I noticed it, almost like I was betraying my own mother. One evening, I finally admitted it. "I feel bad." Helen looked over from the sink. "For what?" "I keep coming to you." She dried her hands on a towel. "You don't have to apologize for that. But you're not my mom." "No." She smiled gently. "I'm not." She let the silence sit for a moment. "That doesn't mean I can't care about you." I didn't know what to say, so I stepped forward and hugged her. She hugged me back without a single word. Some moments don't need explaining. If this part of my story reminds you of someone who showed up for you when they didn't have to, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Sometimes family is built one small act of kindness at a time. By spring, the farm truly felt like home. Not because I'd stopped missing my family, because I had finally stopped feeling like a guest. Then one afternoon, I heard Victor pull into the driveway earlier than usual. He walked inside carrying the day's mail. "Looks like there's something different today," he said. Helen glanced over. "What is it?" Victor held up a single envelope. Cream-colored. My name written neatly across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. He looked at me and smiled. "I think this one's for you." I turned the envelope over in my hands. There was no return address. Only one name written on the back flap. Margaret. I stared at the envelope for a few seconds before opening it. I hadn't seen my grandmother, Margaret, in years. Not because I didn't want to, because after I moved to Victor's farm, visits from my side of the family simply stopped. Helen smiled. "Go ahead." I carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat and steady. "Dear Natalie, I hope Uncle Victor is making you work hard enough to keep you out of trouble." I know he probably is. I smiled before I even reached the second paragraph. That sounded exactly like Grandma Margaret. She asked about school. She asked whether I was eating enough. She reminded me to help Helen without being asked. Not once did she mention my parents. Not once did she ask why I wasn't home. At the bottom, she wrote one simple sentence. "I think about you every day." I read that line 3 times. No one had said something like that to me in a very long time. "Everything okay?" Helen asked. I nodded. "Yeah." I smiled without realizing it. "I think it is." That letter stayed in the top drawer of my desk. A few weeks later, another one arrived. Then another. Soon I started looking forward to them. Grandma never wrote long letters. Usually just 2 or 3 pages. Sometimes she'd tell me about the flowers blooming outside her kitchen window. Sometimes she'd describe a pie she'd ruined because she'd forgotten to set the timer. Once she spent an entire page complaining about squirrels stealing tomatoes from her garden. It was ordinary life, the kind of ordinary I'd been missing. I started writing back. I told her about school, about learning to ride horses, about Victor pretending not to care whenever I beat him at checkers. He absolutely cared. He just refused to admit it. One afternoon, Grandma wrote, "Victor always was stubborn. Don't let him fool you." I laughed so hard that Helen looked over from the stove. "What happened?" "Grandma knows him too well." Helen smiled. "That's because she's known him almost his whole life." The letters became part of my routine. If one hadn't arrived in a while, I'd catch myself checking the mailbox a little more carefully. Unlike before, I wasn't waiting for disappointment anymore. I was waiting for Grandma. Every envelope reminded me that somewhere out there, someone was thinking about me. As I got older, the letters slowly changed. Not dramatically. Just little things. Grandma would ask questions that seemed oddly specific. "How are your grades this semester? Are you keeping copies of your school records? Did you ever receive the scholarship information your counselor mentioned?" At first I figured she was simply curious. Then I noticed something else. Sometimes she'd answer questions I hadn't asked. I'd mention having a rough week. Her next letter would include a story about getting through difficult seasons. I'd write about missing Claire. She'd remind me that relationships sometimes survive long silences. It was almost as if she understood conversations that had never happened on paper. I asked Victor once, "Do you talk to Grandma very often?" "Every now and then." "Do you tell her what's going on with me?" He shrugged. "Not much." Helen smiled over her coffee. "Your grandmother has her own ways of staying informed." Neither of them explained what that meant. I didn't push. Some mysteries don't feel threatening. They just make you curious. Years passed. The stack of Grandma's letters grew thicker inside my desk drawer. Whenever life felt uncertain, I'd reread 1 or 2 of them. Not because they solved my problems, because they reminded me I wasn't facing them alone. One evening, just before I graduated high school, another envelope arrived. The letter felt different. Not sad. More thoughtful. Near the end, she wrote something she'd never said before. "Some people spend their lives trying to rewrite the past. Don't let anyone convince you that your memories aren't real." Then came one final sentence. Short, simple, and impossible to forget. Keep every memory. One day it will matter. Time has a funny way of moving. When you're waiting for someone to come back, every day feels endless. But once you finally start building a life, the years slip by before you realize it. I graduated high school with Victor and Helen sitting in the front row. When my name was called, they stood and clapped louder than anyone else. I searched the crowd anyway. Part of me still hoped I might see my parents. I didn't. On the drive home, Victor glanced at me. "Proud of yourself?" "A little." He laughed. "You should be more than a little." Helen reached over from the passenger seat and squeezed my hand. "We are." Those 3 words meant more than I admitted at the time. I wasn't completely sure what I wanted to do after graduation. I just knew one thing. I liked solving problems. Real problems. Not the kind with one right answer in a textbook. Victor used to hand me broken tools just to see if I could figure out why they stopped working. Sometimes I'd spend an hour taking something apart before putting it back together. I enjoyed the process. Looking closely. Finding what everyone else missed. That habit stayed with me. I enrolled in a technical college and eventually found myself drawn toward construction safety. Most people thought it sounded boring. I loved it. Every building site was like a giant puzzle. Hundreds of moving parts, dozens of decisions. One mistake could hurt someone. My job wasn't to slow people down. It was to make sure everyone went home safely. My first supervisor, Frank, believed speed mattered more than anything. "If it looks good enough," he'd say, "keep the project moving." I disagreed. Quietly at first. One afternoon he pointed toward a temporary scaffold. "Sign off on it." I walked over and climbed halfway up. One support wasn't secured correctly. It probably would have held. Probably wasn't good enough. I climbed back down. "It needs to be fixed." Frank sighed. "Nobody's even using it today." "They will." He looked annoyed. "You really want to delay this over one bracket?" "I want everyone alive tomorrow." For a second I thought he was going to argue. Instead, he called over a crew member. The repair took less than 20 minutes. The next morning, that same scaffold carried 4 workers. Nobody noticed the bracket. Nobody thanked me. That was exactly how I wanted it. The best safety inspections are the ones nobody remembers because nothing bad ever happens. Word started spreading. At first, I worried people would think I was difficult. Instead, contractors began requesting me. One foreman told another, "If Natalie signs off on a site, you can actually trust it." That reputation opened doors, not because I was the smartest inspector, because I refused shortcuts. If something wasn't safe, I said so. It didn't matter who got frustrated. It didn't matter how expensive the delay was. People's lives weren't deadlines. One Friday afternoon, I was sent to inspect a commercial building outside the city. The crew looked exhausted. Concrete trucks were coming and going. Electricians argued with plumbers. Everyone seemed in a hurry. I started my usual routine, checking guardrails, reviewing paperwork, walking each floor carefully instead of rushing. A voice behind me said, "You must be the inspector." I turned around. A man wearing a hard hat balanced a stack of blueprints under one arm. He looked tired, dusty, and slightly amused. "I'm Daniel." He held out his hand. "I've heard you're the one who makes everyone's job harder." I shook his hand. "I've heard that one before." He smiled. "So, should I be worried?" I looked past him toward a section of unfinished framing. "That depends." He followed my gaze. "On what?" "Whether you're willing to let me point out everything that's wrong." Instead of looking offended, Daniel laughed. Daniel wasn't joking. He actually followed me through the entire inspection with a notepad. Every time I pointed out something that needed to be fixed, he wrote it down. No arguing, no eye-rolling, no trying to convince me it was close enough. By the end of the afternoon, I looked at him and said, "You're taking this surprisingly well. He shrugged. My dad was an electrician. So? He used to say safety rules are written because somebody already got hurt. I nodded. That's a good way to look at it. I figured you probably think so. A week later, I inspected another project. Daniel happened to be there too. Then another. Construction circles are smaller than people think. Eventually, we stopped introducing ourselves every time we met. Morning, Inspector. Morning, Daniel. Some days we'd only exchange a few words. Other days we'd grab coffee from the food truck during lunch. The conversations were never forced. He'd ask how many sites I'd visited that week. I'd complain about paperwork. He'd tell me funny stories about subcontractors who somehow managed to lose expensive tools in obvious places. One afternoon, he admitted he'd spent 2 hours searching for a tape measure that had been hanging from his own belt. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. You cannot tell anyone that. Oh, I absolutely can. Please don't. I'll think about it. He shook his head. I knew I shouldn't have trusted you. It felt easy. There wasn't any game to it. No one trying to impress the other, just two people who genuinely enjoyed talking. Months passed before we ever went anywhere outside work. Even then, it wasn't really a date. At least neither of us called it that. We met at a small diner after work because neither of us felt like cooking. Daniel looked around the place and smiled. I like restaurants where the menus are sticky. I laughed. That's a strange standard. They usually have the best burgers. Annoyingly, he was right. We kept meeting, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to walk through a weekend farmer's market. Sometimes we'd sit on a bench with coffee and talk about absolutely nothing important. One thing stood out to me. Daniel asked questions, lots of them, about work, about books, about the farm, about Victor teaching me to repair fences, about Helen's bread that somehow tasted amazing no matter how crooked it looked. But there was one subject he never pushed. My family. He knew they weren't part of my life. That was enough for him. Once, I mentioned Grandma Margaret had mailed me another letter. He smiled. You seem happy whenever you talk about her. I am? I'm glad you've got someone like that. He didn't ask why she was the only one writing. He simply accepted what I'd offered. That kind of respect was unfamiliar. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed it. Eventually, I invited him to Victor and Helen's farm. I warned him first. If Victor likes you, he'll barely say anything. And if he doesn't? He'll barely say anything. Daniel laughed. That doesn't help. It turned out Victor liked him. You could tell because he invited Daniel to help repair a fence. For Victor, that was practically an emotional speech. Helen liked him too. Mostly because he insisted on washing dishes after dinner without being asked. As we drove home that evening, Daniel smiled. I get why you love that place. It feels like home. It does. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Then he glanced over at me. You know. What? I've been wondering something. I waited. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Okay. He kept his eyes on the road. In all the time I've known you, do you ever think about going back? I didn't answer Daniel right away. The road stretched ahead of us, quiet except for the sound of the tires against the pavement. He didn't repeat the question. He just kept driving. Finally, I said, I used to? He glanced at me for a second before looking back at the road. What changed? I stopped waiting. He nodded slowly. For them? For everything. Neither of us spoke for a minute. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that gives someone room to decide how much they want to say. I took a deep breath. I was 13 when I left home. You lived with Victor after that. Yeah. I always assumed it was temporary. So did I. That sentence surprised even me. I'd never actually said it out loud before. Daniel rested one hand on the steering wheel. What happened? My parents said they needed help for a little while. I looked out the window. They promised they'd come back. They didn't. No. I gave a small smile, but there wasn't much happiness in it. At first I counted weekends. Then I laughed quietly. Eventually I stopped counting. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't try to explain my parents. He didn't offer theories. He simply listened. I kept thinking there had to be a reason. There probably was. There was. I looked at him. It just wasn't a reason that made me feel any less abandoned. He let that sit for a moment. I'm sorry. Those were the only 2 words he said. Not, I'm sorry for them. Not, I'm sorry you misunderstood. Just, I'm sorry. It was exactly what I needed to hear. You know what's strange? I asked. What? I don't spend my life hoping they'll apologize anymore. When did that happen? I don't know. I thought about it for a second. Maybe it happened so slowly I didn't notice. I smiled faintly. One day I realized I wasn't angry every morning. And then? I realized I wasn't expecting a phone call anymore. Daniel nodded. That sounds peaceful. It is. But it's also sad. It can be both. That answer stayed with me, because he was right. Some endings don't feel dramatic. Sometimes they just quietly become part of who you are. A few weeks later, Daniel asked me to marry him. It wasn't a grand public proposal. No cameras, no restaurant full of strangers. We were walking through the farm after dinner when he stopped beside one of the fences Victor and I had repaired years earlier. I've been thinking about this for a long time, he said. So have I replied. He laughed. I haven't even asked yet. I know. He pulled a small ring from his jacket pocket. Natalie, would you marry me? Yes. I didn't hesitate, not even for a second. Victor pretended he wasn't watching from the barn. Helen cried anyway. Life kept moving. Work, marriage, weekend visits to the farm, letters from Grandma Margaret. Those letters never stopped. If anything, they became even more meaningful after I got married. She always asked about Daniel. She remembered little details I'd forgotten telling her. One afternoon, months after our wedding, I came home to find Daniel sorting through the mail. He looked up with a smile. I think your favorite person wrote again. He held out the familiar cream-colored envelope. I recognized Grandma's handwriting immediately, but this envelope felt different. It was thicker than usual, almost as if she'd tucked something else inside besides a letter. I turned it over in my hands. Daniel noticed my expression. What is it? I ran my thumb along the sealed edge. I don't know. Then I looked at the return address. For the first time, Grandma Margaret had included one. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was Grandma Margaret's usual letter. But there was something else. A folded sheet of stationery with a list written in her neat handwriting. It wasn't a grocery list. It wasn't a recipe. It looked more like a reminder. Insurance papers, old bank records, family photographs, school documents, letters. Some of the items had little check marks beside them. Others didn't. I frowned. Daniel looked over from the couch. Everything okay? I think so. I handed him the extra page. He read it once before looking back at me. What's this for? I have no idea. The letter itself answered part of the question. Dear Natalie, I've started organizing things around the house. At my age, it's better to know where everything is than leave someone else to guess later. That sentence made my stomach tighten. Grandma had never talked about her age like that before. She always joked about getting older. This didn't sound like a joke. The rest of the letter was shorter than usual. She asked about Daniel. She reminded me not to work too many long hours. Then she added one line that stayed with me. Don't worry if I seem a little slower these days. That's just life reminding me to sit down once in a while. I folded the letter carefully. Daniel watched me. You're worried. A little. Have you called her? Not yet. You probably should. He wasn't criticizing me, just stating the obvious. The next evening, I did call. Grandma answered after several rings. Her voice was still warm, still unmistakably hers, but she sounded tired. Natalie, it's me. I know exactly who it is. I smiled. How are you feeling? Oh, you know. I actually don't. She laughed softly. Fair enough. She admitted she'd been getting worn out more easily. Her doctor wanted her to slow down. She complained about that almost as much as she complained about the medicine. I've got too much to do. What could possibly be so urgent? My paperwork. I remembered the list inside the envelope. You really are organizing everything? I've been putting it off for years. She paused. Now I'd rather leave things in order. Something about the way she said it made my chest feel heavy. I should come visit. I'd like that. When would be good? Oh, whenever you can. It sounded simple. Too simple. We talked for another half hour. About Daniel. About Victor and Helen. About work. When we hung up, I immediately opened my calendar. I can take Friday off, I told Daniel. We could leave Thursday evening. He nodded. Let's do it. But work had other plans. A major project failed an inspection. Emergency meetings filled my schedule. One delay turned into another. Every evening, I'd tell myself I'd call Grandma tomorrow. Every morning, something else came up. The guilt started creeping in. Helen noticed it when we visited the farm. You've been quiet. I keep meaning to go see Grandma. Then go. I will. When? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because I honestly didn't know. A few days later, while I was reviewing inspection reports at my desk, my phone vibrated. It was Victor. He almost never called during work hours. I answered immediately. Hey, Victor. There was a long pause. His voice sounded lower than usual. Natalie. I pushed my chair back. What happened? He took a slow breath. You need to come home. I gripped the phone tighter. Is it Grandma? His silence told me before he spoke. She passed away early this morning. I don't remember much about the drive to the funeral. Daniel drove. I stared out the window. Every few miles, I'd remember another letter, another birthday card, another sentence Grandma had written that somehow arrived exactly when I needed it. I kept thinking the last time we spoke should have been longer. I should have visited sooner. I should have made time. Daniel reached over once and squeezed my hand. He didn't tell me to stop blaming myself. He just stayed there beside me. Sometimes that's all a person can do. The church was already full when we arrived. Cars lined both sides of the road. People stood outside talking quietly. I recognized almost every face. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in years. A few looked surprised to see me. Most simply nodded. Sorry for your loss. You too. The conversations ended almost as quickly as they began. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked why I'd stayed away all those years. It was as if we had silently agreed not to touch the past. Inside the church, I spotted my parents. Mom was surrounded by relatives. She accepted hugs, dabbed at her eyes, and thanked everyone for coming. Dad stood nearby, shaking hands. Claire was there too. She looked older, of course. So did I. For a second, our eyes met across the room. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us walked over. There were simply too many years standing between us. Daniel leaned toward me. Do you want to say hello? I looked at my family, then back at him. Not today. He nodded once. Okay. We found seats near the back, close enough to honor Grandma, far enough to avoid becoming part of anyone else's conversations. The service was simple. Friends shared stories about Grandma's kindness. A neighbor talked about the meals she'd delivered whenever someone was sick. Her pastor spoke about quiet faith and steady generosity. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. She had never needed attention. She just showed up for people. Again and again. When the service ended, everyone slowly gathered outside. Clusters of relatives formed almost immediately. I watched cousins catching up, children running between adults, people making plans to meet for lunch afterward. It felt strangely familiar, like watching a family from the outside instead of belonging to one. An aunt I barely remembered stopped beside me. "It's been a long time." "It has." "You look well." "Thank you." She hesitated. "I'm sure Margaret was happy you came." "I hope so." She gave my arm a quick pat before walking away. That was the longest conversation I had with anyone from my side of the family. My parents never came over. Dad glanced in my direction once. Then someone else started talking to him. Mom stayed surrounded by relatives almost the entire afternoon. Claire looked at me several times. Each time, she seemed like she wanted to say something. Each time, someone interrupted her before she moved. Eventually, I stopped expecting anyone to cross the distance between us. Daniel quietly stood beside me through all of it. He never tried to fill the silence. He never suggested we should make peace. He simply let me grieve the person we'd actually come to say goodbye to. When the cemetery began emptying, we started walking toward the parking lot. I thought we were leaving. Then I heard someone call my name. "Ms. Carter?" I turned around. A woman in a dark navy suit was standing near the church steps, holding a leather folder. "I apologize for stopping you." "Yes?" She offered a polite smile. "My name is Rebecca Collins. I was Margaret's attorney." She glanced toward the remaining relatives before lowering her voice. "If you don't mind, I need to speak with you after everyone else has gone." Daniel and I waited until the church parking lot was nearly empty. The conversations faded. Cars pulled away one by one. Eventually, Rebecca Collins walked over and motioned toward a small meeting room inside the church. "Thank you for staying." She closed the door behind us. The room was simple. Just a round table, 4 chairs, and a box of tissues someone had thoughtfully left in the middle. Rebecca placed her leather folder on the table before taking a seat. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "So am I," I replied. She offered a sympathetic smile. "Margaret spoke about you often." That caught me off guard. "She did?" "Very often." Rebecca opened the folder. "I represented your grandmother for many years. During that time, she updated her estate plan more than once." I listened quietly. She was very organized. I couldn't help smiling. That sounds like her. It certainly does. Rebecca slid a copy of the will toward me. "Margaret wanted you to receive this personally." I glanced down at the first page. My name was there, right near the beginning. Rebecca continued. "Under the terms of her will, you are the primary beneficiary of her estate." I blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" "The family home has been left to you." For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood. Rebecca kept going. "You've also inherited her investment accounts, several savings funds, and a number of protected financial assets." I stared at her. There has to be some mistake. "There isn't." "My mother?" Rebecca shook her head gently. "The document is very clear." "What about my father?" "Claire?" "The estate has specific distributions for several relatives." She paused. "But the majority of Margaret's assets were intentionally left to you." I leaned back in my chair. None of it made sense. Grandma loved the whole family. She wrote to me. But she never hinted at anything like this. Daniel rested a hand lightly on my arm. "You okay?" "I honestly don't know." Rebecca waited until I looked at her again. "Margaret expected you'd be surprised." "I am?" She left written instructions explaining many of her decisions. My heart skipped a beat. "There are explanations?" "There are." She reached into the folder again. Before we discuss those, there's something else you should understand. She pointed to a section of the will. This estate includes what's called a no contest clause. I frowned. What does that mean? If anyone named in the will challenges Margaret's decisions in court without legal grounds, they risk forfeiting what was left to them. Daniel looked at Rebecca. So she anticipated conflict. Rebecca answered carefully. Margaret preferred to prevent it. I slowly nodded. That sounded exactly like Grandma. She never liked arguments. She planned around them instead. So, this is final? Assuming everyone respects the terms of the will, yes. The room grew quiet. I looked down at the paperwork again. The family home, investment accounts, protected assets. It wasn't excitement I felt, it was responsibility, and 100 unanswered questions. Rebecca closed the folder. There's one last thing. She stood and walked to a cabinet against the wall. For the first time, I noticed something sitting beside it. An old brown suitcase. The leather was worn. The corners were faded with age. It looked nothing like the black briefcase I'd eventually carry into my mother's birthday party. Rebecca carefully placed the suitcase on the table between us. Then she looked directly at me. Margaret specifically instructed me not to give this to anyone else. She rested one hand on the handle, and she told me to wait until she was gone before letting you open it. I looked at the old suitcase for a long moment before touching it. It wasn't locked, just worn from years of use. Rebecca nodded. You can open it. I lifted the lid slowly. There wasn't jewelry inside. No cash, no family photo albums. Instead, every inch of the suitcase was filled with neatly labeled folders. Each one had a handwritten tab. School records, bank documents, correspondence, guardianship, education fund. Everything was arranged with the same careful attention Grandma had always put into her letters. I reached for the first folder. My hands were shaking. Inside were copies of report cards I'd forgotten existed, elementary school certificates, permission slips with my parents' signatures, even a few childhood drawings I'd made in school. I smiled through tears. I haven't seen these in years. Rebecca nodded. Margaret saved everything. I carefully set that folder aside and opened another. This one was different. Official documents, typed forms, legal language. Near the top was a date from the year I turned 13. My eyes stopped on one phrase. Temporary guardianship agreement. I frowned. What is this? Rebecca folded her hands. The paperwork allowing Victor and Helen to become your legal guardians. I knew they signed something. She nodded. But I don't believe you knew the full extent of it. I kept reading. Every page carried signatures. My father's, my mother's, witnesses, notary stamps. Nothing looked informal. Nothing looked rushed. This wasn't a simple permission slip for a child to stay with relatives. It was a complete legal transfer of responsibility. I looked up. My parents told me it was only for a few months. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid another document toward me. It was filed just behind the guardianship papers. This was submitted at the same time. I read the title. Transfer of Educational Responsibility. The form authorized Victor and Helen to make school decisions, approve records, and manage educational matters on my behalf. I felt my chest tighten. They planned for me to stay. Rebecca spoke gently. The documents suggest they expected the arrangement to last considerably longer than you were told. Daniel looked over at me. You never knew? I slowly shook my head. No. I honestly believed my parents were coming back. Every weekend, every birthday, every Christmas. While all along, there had been paperwork saying otherwise. I swallowed hard and opened another folder. Bank statements, receipts, copies of tuition payments. There were transfers I'd never heard about. Money sent from one account to another. Scholarship paperwork. School expenses. I recognized Victor's signature on several forms. Then I noticed another name appearing over and over. Margaret. She hadn't just written letters. She'd quietly helped pay for things too. Books, school fees, application costs, small amounts spread across many years. Never enough to draw attention. Always enough to make a difference. I covered my mouth. I had no idea. Rebecca's expression softened. Margaret wanted it that way. Why didn't she tell me? Because she believed helping someone doesn't always require being recognized for it. That sounded exactly like Grandma. I kept turning pages. Every folder answered one question and created 3 more. Nothing was thrown together. Every receipt matched another record. Every letter connected to a document. Every date had been preserved. It was as if Grandma had quietly spent decades building a timeline no one else knew existed. Daniel looked around the table. She documented everything. Rebecca nodded once. She did. I leaned back, overwhelmed. I thought I'd inherited a house. Instead, it felt like I'd inherited the truth. Rebecca rested her hand lightly on the final unopened folder. She looked directly at me before speaking. Natalie? What? This suitcase explains a great deal. She paused. But I need you to understand something. I waited. This. She gently tapped the stack of folders. Is only the beginning. I pulled the next folder closer and took a slow breath. Rebecca didn't interrupt. Daniel stayed quiet beside me. The room had gone completely still except for the sound of paper turning. I decided not to rush. If Grandma had spent decades putting this together, I owed it to her to read every page carefully. The first few documents seemed ordinary. School enrollment forms, medical records, copies of permission slips Victor and Helen had signed after becoming my guardians. Nothing shocking, just proof of the life I'd actually lived. Then I started comparing dates. One page led to another. A school invoice matched a bank transfer. A receipt matched a handwritten note from Margaret. Everything fit together almost perfectly. Almost. I stopped at one statement and frowned. Something didn't add up. This payment, I said quietly. Rebecca looked over. What about it? It says money was set aside for my education. It was. I turned another page. But this account doesn't match the next transfer. Rebecca nodded as if she'd expected me to notice. Keep reading. I followed the paper trail. The money didn't disappear. It moved. Just not where I expected. One transfer became another, then another. Different account numbers, different dates. Some payments eventually reached Victor and Helen for school expenses. Others went somewhere else first. I looked back at Rebecca. Why would they move the money through another account? I wanted you to ask that. She slid another document across the table. This explains part of it. It was another bank record. Same period, same amounts. Different account holder. I recognized the last name immediately. Carter. My parents. I blinked several times. I don't understand. Rebecca spoke carefully. Margaret began requesting copies of financial records because certain numbers weren't matching what she'd been told. So she investigated? In her own quiet way. I kept reading. There wasn't any dramatic note accusing someone of stealing. No angry letter. Just records, dates, transfers, canceled checks. Grandma hadn't written conclusions. She'd simply preserved facts. Daniel leaned closer. The money was supposed to help you. It was, I answered slowly. At least part of it. But not all of it. I nodded. The pattern became clearer the longer I looked. Funds intended for my education often took an unnecessary detour before reaching their final destination. Sometimes the amounts even changed. Not by much. Just enough that most people probably wouldn't notice. Grandma had noticed. Of course she had. She'd kept every receipt, every deposit, every withdrawal. I remembered one Christmas when Victor quietly told me we'd have to buy used textbooks that year. At the time, I assumed money was simply tight. Now, I wasn't so sure. I looked through another folder. There was one handwritten note from Grandma tucked between two financial statements. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply read, "Always compare what people say with what they sign." I read it twice, then a third time. Daniel exhaled slowly. She knew. I think she suspected long before anyone else. Rebecca nodded. Margaret believed accusations without proof only divide families. So she collected proof instead. Exactly. Hours seemed to disappear as I kept reading. Every answer uncovered another question. The picture wasn't complete yet, but it was changing. The story I'd believed as a 13-year-old. The story my relatives still believed. The story my parents had repeated for years. None of them matched these records. I reached for another folder near the bottom of the suitcase. This one was thicker than the others. Inside were several official forms clipped together. The very first page made me freeze. There, near the bottom, was a signature. Not my father's. Not my mother's. I knew that handwriting. I'd seen it hundreds of times in Grandma's letters. But this signature appeared beside a document I had never imagined she'd had to sign. I stared at it without saying a word. Rebecca noticed exactly where my eyes had stopped. "Yes," she said softly. "That's the one I was waiting for you to find." My phone rang 2 days later while I was finishing inspection reports at my kitchen table. I glanced at the screen. Mom. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd saved the wrong contact. She hadn't called in years. Not on birthdays. Not when I graduated. Not when I got married. Not even after Grandma's funeral. Daniel looked up from the other side of the room. "You going to answer?" "I don't know." The phone kept ringing. Eventually, I picked it up. "Hello?" "Natalie." Her voice sounded unusually bright. "So, you answered?" "I did. I've been thinking about you." I didn't know what to say to that. She filled the silence herself. "How have you been, sweetheart?" Sweetheart. I couldn't remember the last time she'd called me that. "I'm doing fine." "Oh, that's wonderful." She laughed softly. "I was telling your father how proud we are of everything you've accomplished." I stared at the stack of documents Rebecca had sent home with me. Proud. That was an interesting choice of word. "That's nice to hear. It really is true." She kept talking, asking about my work, about Daniel, about the horse farm, about Victor and Helen. Questions that should have been asked years ago. She sounded almost rehearsed. Every sentence was warm. Every pause felt carefully timed. It reminded me of watching someone perform in a commercial. Friendly, comforting, almost believable. Almost. She never asked how I'd handled Grandma's death. She never apologized for the years we'd lost. She never mentioned the documents. Instead, she said, "Families shouldn't stay apart forever." I leaned back in my chair. That's one way to look at it. She ignored the edge in my voice. "I know we can't change the past." No, we couldn't. But we can make new memories. Another carefully chosen sentence. Daniel quietly walked outside, giving me privacy without saying a word. I appreciated that. Mom kept talking about cousins, aunts, uncles, people asking about me. She painted a picture of a family that had simply drifted apart, not one that had left a 13-year-old behind. I listened more than I spoke. The less I said, the more she volunteered. It became almost fascinating. She spoke with confidence, like she truly believed enough kindness could erase 2 decades of silence. Then something occurred to me. She still hadn't mentioned the inheritance. Not once. No questions about Grandma's will, no comments about the house, nothing about Rebecca, nothing about lawyers. That omission felt louder than anything she'd actually said. I asked casually, "Has anything changed since the funeral?" There was the smallest pause, barely a second. "No," she answered smoothly. "Why would it?" Interesting. Either she genuinely didn't know, or she was pretending not to. Neither possibility made me comfortable. She changed the subject immediately. "Claire has been asking about you." That surprised me. "Has she?" "I think she'd love to see you." I pictured my sister across the banquet hall just days earlier, watching me, saying nothing. "I haven't spoken to Claire in a long time." "I know." Mom sighed. "That's exactly why we should all get together." There it was. Not a request, a destination she'd been steering toward since the call began. She softened her voice even more. "I've been planning something." "What kind of something?" "Nothing formal." She laughed. "Just family." I waited. "I think it's time we stopped living in the past." Another pause. Then she finally said it. "We're putting together a little family reunion." She sounded almost excited. "I'd really love for you to come." I looked toward the black briefcase sitting beside my desk. Inside were copies of every document I'd decided to keep with me. The originals were safely stored elsewhere. I rested my hand on the briefcase without thinking. Mom waited patiently for my answer. I smiled to myself. Not because I believed her, because I suddenly understood why she'd called. "I'll think about it," I said. Her relief came a little too quickly. "I hope you do. We'd all love to have you back together with the family." I ended the call a few minutes later. The house was quiet again. Daniel stepped back inside. "Everything okay?" I looked at the phone one last time before setting it down. "She wants me to come to a family reunion." Daniel poured us both a cup of coffee before either of us spoke. He slid one mug across the table. "So," he said, "what do you think this reunion is really about?" I wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I don't believe it's about reconnecting." "You think it's the inheritance?" "I think it's too much of a coincidence." Grandma's funeral had barely passed. The will had already been read. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, my parents wanted family dinners and second chances. The timing spoke louder than my mother's words ever could. Daniel nodded slowly. If they wanted a relationship, they had 20 years to build one. Exactly. Neither of us said anything for a moment. He wasn't trying to convince me one way or the other. That was something I'd always appreciated about him. He gave advice when I asked for it. Otherwise, he trusted me to reach my own conclusions. "What are you leaning toward?" he finally asked. "I think I need to hear what they have to say." He looked at me carefully. "And?" "I don't plan on walking in unprepared." The next afternoon, I met Rebecca at her office. She already had a legal pad waiting on the conference table. "I assumed you'd receive a phone call," she said with a small smile. "You weren't surprised?" "Not at all." I sat down. "They invited me to a family reunion." Rebecca nodded as though she'd expected those exact words. "And you're considering it?" "I am." She folded her hands. "Then let's discuss how to do it safely." That caught my attention. "Safely?" "I don't mean physically." She leaned back in her chair. "I mean emotionally and legally." She reached into a folder and pulled out a notepad. "Before you decide anything, ask yourself one question." I waited. "What do you want from this meeting?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. It wasn't as easy to answer as I'd expected. Did I want an apology? Not really. An explanation? Maybe. Closure? Possibly. But none of those felt like the real reason. Rebecca noticed my hesitation. People often attend these conversations hoping the other side will suddenly become different. I don't expect that. Good. She smiled gently. Because disappointment usually begins with unrealistic expectations. She let that sink in before continuing. If you go, don't go looking for healing. What should I go looking for? The truth. That answer felt surprisingly simple. Rebecca continued. And one more thing. She opened another folder containing copies of Grandma's documents. Never attend a meeting like this without preparation. I wasn't planning to. Good. She tapped the stack of papers. Know your facts better than anyone else in the room. She wasn't suggesting I confront anyone. Not yet. She was reminding me that memory could be challenged. Documents couldn't. Take copies, she said. Leave the originals somewhere secure. I already have. Excellent. Daniel, who had joined us after work, finally spoke. What if they're sincere? Rebecca looked at him. Then being prepared won't hurt the conversation. And if they're not? She gave a small shrug. Preparation becomes essential. I couldn't argue with that. The meeting ended without anyone telling me what decision to make. That was intentional. Rebecca believed the choice had to be mine. On the drive home, Daniel broke the silence. Feeling any clearer? A little. You've already survived the hardest part of your life. I glanced over at him. This is just a conversation. I smiled. You make it sound simple. No. He smiled back. I just don't want you forgetting who you are before you walk into that room. That stayed with me all evening. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. The scared 13-year-old who waited by the mailbox wasn't making this decision. The woman who had built her own life was. That night, I found my phone and opened my mother's message again. The invitation was still there. Short, friendly. As if the last 20 years could fit between two polite sentences. I read it one last time. Then I typed my reply. I'll be there. I looked at the screen for a second before pressing send. The message disappeared. There was no taking it back now. 3 days before the reunion, my phone buzzed while I was finishing paperwork at the office. The name on the screen caught me off guard. Claire. I stared at it long enough for the call to stop. A second later, a text appeared. Can we meet? Just us. No mom. No dad. I read it twice, then a third time. Daniel noticed my expression when I got home. Who was it? My sister. He raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. It is. What do you think she wants? I honestly don't know. She hadn't tried contacting me in years. Not after Grandma's funeral. Not after the will. Not after Mom invited me to the reunion. Now, suddenly, she wanted to meet alone. Part of me wanted to ignore the message. The other part wondered if I'd regret it. Daniel didn't tell me what to do. He simply asked, if you don't go, will you always wonder what she wanted? That answered my question. The following afternoon, I met Claire at a quiet coffee shop halfway between our towns. She was already there when I arrived. She stood as soon as she saw me. For a second, it looked like she wasn't sure whether to hug me. Instead, she settled for an awkward smile. Hi. Hi. Neither of us knew how to start. 20 years leaves a lot of empty space between two people. We sat down. The waitress took our orders. Then another silence settled over the table. Claire finally laughed nervously. This is weird. It is. I kept imagining this conversation. So did I. She looked older than I remembered. Not because of gray hair or wrinkles. Life had simply happened to both of us. She wrapped both hands around her coffee. I almost didn't ask you to come. Why did you? She looked down. Because I don't like not knowing anymore. I waited. She searched for the right words. When you left, I noticed she still used that word. Left. Everything just fell apart. I didn't interrupt. Mom cried for months. Dad barely talked about it. Whenever I asked where you were, they always gave different answers. I stayed quiet. Sometimes they said you needed space. Sometimes they said you were angry. Sometimes they said you didn't want anything to do with us. She shook her head. I stopped asking after a while. There wasn't any anger in her voice, only confusion. I believed them. She met my eyes for the first time. I thought you chose to leave. The words landed differently than I expected. Not because they hurt, because she sounded completely sincere. She wasn't repeating a lie to manipulate me. She was describing what she'd honestly believed since she was a teenager. I figured, she continued, if someone disappears for 20 years, there has to be a reason. There was. I know. She hesitated. But I always thought the reason was us. I gave a small, sad smile. In a way, it was. Claire frowned. I don't understand. I know. She leaned forward slightly. Mom says this reunion is a chance to fix everything. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I'd heard those exact words before. Claire kept talking. I don't expect us to become sisters overnight. I don't even know if that's possible. She took a slow breath. But I need to ask you something. I nodded. Why did you never come back? There it was. The question that had lived between us for 2 decades. Not asked with anger. Not as an accusation. Just quiet honesty. I looked at my coffee, then back at Claire. For the first time since we'd sat down, I realized she wasn't trying to defend our parents. She was trying to understand her own childhood. She'd grown up with one version of the story. I'd lived another. I took a slow breath. I need you to listen carefully. She nodded without speaking. What I'm about to say isn't easy. I'm listening. I held her gaze. Then I answered as calmly as I could. Claire. I paused for just a moment. That's not what happened. Claire didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, waiting. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain manila folder. I hadn't planned to bring it. Something told me I should. I don't expect you to believe me, I said. She frowned. Then why meet me? Because I don't want you choosing between my version and Mom's. I placed the folder on the table. I'd rather you look at something neither of us can change. She glanced down. What is it? One document. Just one? I nodded. If you read everything at once, you'll think I'm trying to overwhelm you. She slowly opened the folder. The first page was the guardianship agreement. Nothing else. No letters, no bank records, no notes from Margaret. Just the legal paperwork. Claire skimmed the first few lines, then she stopped. Her eyes moved back to the top. She started reading again, more slowly this time. What is this? The agreement that allowed Uncle Victor and Aunt Helen to become my legal guardians. She looked up immediately. I knew you stayed with them. You knew I lived there. Isn't that the same thing? No. I watched her continue reading. Her forehead tightened. This says temporary guardianship. It does. She turned another page, then another. I stayed quiet. She wasn't reading like someone looking for proof I was wrong. She was reading like someone trying to understand a language she'd never seen before. I've never seen this. I know. Mom never told me there was paperwork. I know. Dad didn't either. I know. Her breathing became noticeably slower. She pointed to the signatures. Those are their signatures. Yes. They actually signed this? Yes. She looked from the page to me several times. I thought... She stopped. What? I thought they asked Uncle Victor to help for a little while. So did I. She blinked. You mean, I believed I'd be home in a few months. The coffee between us had gone cold. Neither of us touched it. Claire kept staring at the document. I remember asking Mom when you were coming back. I listened. She always said you needed more time. I didn't interrupt. I believed her. I know. She rubbed one hand across her forehead. This doesn't make sense. I've spent years saying the same thing. She looked genuinely shaken. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just unsteady. Like someone discovering a piece from a puzzle they'd been assembling incorrectly their entire life. I don't understand why they wouldn't tell me. I can't answer that. She whispered more to herself than to me. Why hide this? I had wondered the same thing for years. Finally, she pushed the folder gently back toward me. I don't know what to think. You don't have to decide today. She searched my face. Is there more? There was. A lot more. The suitcase, the financial records, Grandma's letters, the education transfers. But I remembered Rebecca's advice. One truth at a time. There is. She swallowed. Can I see it? Not yet. She looked disappointed. Why not? Because if this one document doesn't make you ask questions. I rested my hand on the folder. The rest won't matter. She didn't argue. For the first time since we'd met, she simply sat there in silence. Not because she had nothing to say, because everything she'd believed suddenly felt uncertain. When we finally stood to leave, she didn't hug me. Neither did I. She paused beside her car. I need time. I understand. She looked at me one last time. I don't know who's telling the truth anymore. I nodded. I think that's an honest place to start. She got into her car without another word. I watched her drive away until she disappeared around the corner. For the first time in 20 years, Claire wasn't certain what had happened to me, and she drove away carrying a question no one else in the family even knew existed. I couldn't stop thinking about Claire after she walked away with that copy of the guardianship papers. I wasn't expecting an apology. I wasn't even expecting her to believe me. What surprised me was that she hadn't argued. She had just stared at the document, looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, then quietly left. For the first time in years, someone from my family had questions instead of answers. That alone felt different. Daniel noticed I was distracted over dinner. You think she's going to say something? I shook my head. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. He reached for my hand across the table. Whatever happens, you told the truth. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach never really disappeared. Because the truth has a strange way of making people uncomfortable before it sets anyone free. A few days later, Claire sat across from our parents in their living room. I wasn't there, of course. I only learned what happened much later. It started with something small. So, Claire casually stirred her coffee. Why did Natalie leave when she was little? Susan answered immediately. She was always stubborn. She wanted to stay with Victor because he spoiled her. The answer came too fast. Claire frowned. I thought you said she only stayed there temporarily because of money. Susan blinked. Well, yes. At first. And then? There was a pause. Things changed. Claire waited. Neither of them continued. She glanced toward Dad. He kept reading the newspaper without turning a page. Did you ever sign legal guardianship papers? The newspaper slowly lowered. What? I asked if either of you signed guardianship papers. Dad folded the paper carefully before answering. Where did you hear something like that? Claire shrugged. I was just asking. Susan laughed, but it sounded forced. You've been watching too many legal dramas. Claire smiled politely. Maybe. Nobody laughed with her. The room suddenly felt much quieter. She changed the subject. Or at least, she pretended to. A few minutes later, she asked another simple question. Did you visit Natalie while she lived with Uncle Victor? Susan hesitated. We were busy trying to rebuild everything. So, yes? We visited when we could. How often? Neither parent answered. Dad stood up. I need some fresh air. He walked outside before anyone could stop him. Claire watched through the window as he paced across the backyard with his hands shoved into his pockets. That wasn't like him. Not over a simple question. The next weekend she tried again. Different approach. Different question. Were you surprised Grandma left everything to Natalie? Susan's smile disappeared for just a second. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Claire tilted her head. But Rebecca said Grandma updated the will several times over the years. Susan's expression tightened. Rebecca talks too much. Claire noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. Every conversation about Grandma ended with irritation. Every conversation about Natalie ended with blame. Every conversation about the past ended before it actually explained anything. Little pieces stopped fitting together. At dinner that evening, Claire mentioned finding one of our old childhood photo albums. There aren't many pictures of Natalie after she was 10. Susan quickly replied, she didn't like having her picture taken. Claire almost accepted the answer. Almost. Then she remembered something from our meeting. I'd shown her school transfer papers, medical forms, guardianship records. Someone who hated photographs still went to school, still had birthdays, still existed. So where were all those years? Why had they disappeared from every family album? She didn't ask. She simply closed the album. A few days later, Dad knocked on Claire's bedroom door. You've been asking a lot of questions lately. She looked up from her laptop. Is that a problem? He leaned against the doorway. I just don't want old misunderstandings getting stirred up. What misunderstandings? He rubbed the back of his neck. Some things are better left alone. Claire studied his face. He looked tired, not angry, nervous. That caught her completely off guard. Growing up, she'd always believed our father had answers for everything. Now he seemed afraid of the questions. That night, she opened her phone. My contact information was still there. Her thumb hovered over my name for several seconds. Then she locked the screen without sending anything. One decision came easily, though. Whatever she had just uncovered, or whatever she was beginning to suspect, our parents weren't going to hear about our meeting. Not from her. Stacks of paper covered Rebecca's conference table. At first glance, it looked like chaos. Guardianship records, school transfers, medical forms, bank statements, letters, handwritten notes, receipts that were older than some of the people attending the reunion. Rebecca adjusted her glasses and slid one folder away from the others. This one stays. She pushed another aside. This one doesn't. I looked at the growing piles. I thought every document mattered. They matter emotionally, she said. Not necessarily legally. There was a difference. And that difference was exactly why I wanted Rebecca beside me. She wasn't interested in telling the strongest story. She wanted the strongest facts. For the next several hours, we worked almost without stopping. Every document had to answer a simple question. Could it be verified? If the answer was yes, it stayed. If the answer depended on assumptions or memories, it came out. One old note from Margaret described how devastated I had been waiting for my parents to visit. Rebecca smiled sympathetically. I believe every word. She gently placed it into another folder. But feelings aren't evidence. I nodded. I understand. Surprisingly, letting go of those papers didn't hurt. In a strange way, it made me feel calmer. Because I wasn't trying to prove that my childhood had been painful. Pain is impossible to measure. I only needed to prove what had actually happened. Dates, signatures, transfers, legal decisions, money. Facts don't need dramatic speeches. They just need to exist. Daniel stopped by with coffee and sandwiches sometime that afternoon. He looked around the room and laughed softly. I've never seen paperwork treated like a military operation. Rebecca smiled. It has to be. Daniel handed me a cup. You okay? Tired. But I looked at the organized folders. Less overwhelmed. That was the truth. For weeks, I'd been drowning in thousands of pages. Now everything finally had an order, an actual timeline. Rebecca had pinned a long sheet of paper across the wall. Year by year. Every major event. When I moved to Victor's farm. When guardianship papers were signed. Every school enrollment. Every financial transfer made on my behalf. Every letter Margaret mailed. Looking at it all together was unsettling. Not because anything was shocking anymore. Because it was consistent. My memories weren't perfect. The documents weren't emotional. Yet somehow they matched. Rebecca stepped closer to the timeline. This is what survives scrutiny. She tapped one date with her pen. Everything before this point has supporting records. Another tap. This transfer matches the bank statements. Another. This school enrollment matches the county records. Nothing depended on anyone believing my version. The records supported each other. That realization gave me more peace than I expected. Late in the afternoon, Rebecca opened one final envelope. This wasn't with the legal files. The handwriting immediately caught my attention. Margaret's. I recognized it before unfolding the paper. The letter wasn't addressed to a court or a lawyer. It was addressed to me. My dear Natalie, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to explain these things myself. Please don't mistake these papers for revenge. That was never my intention. I kept them because memories change. People forget. Sometimes they convince themselves they remember events differently. Paper doesn't do that. Paper waits. I prayed these records would never be necessary. But if they ever reached your hands, I wanted you to have something stronger than anger. The truth deserves patience, not because it always wins quickly, because it never needs to change. Please don't carry this as a burden. Carry it as freedom. You never needed permission to tell your own story. Love always, Grandma Margaret. By the time I finished reading, I realized I hadn't said a word for several minutes. Rebecca quietly handed me a tissue. I wondered when you'd find that. I smiled through damp eyes. She knew. Rebecca nodded. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. Daniel squeezed my shoulder. She wasn't preparing you for a fight. No. I carefully folded the letter. She was preparing me not to be afraid of one. We spent another hour checking every folder one last time. Nothing extra. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing we couldn't support. Just the facts. Rebecca closed the final binder. I think we're finished. I looked across the table. Months of uncertainty had been reduced to one organized case, not my entire life. Just the part that could be proven. I reached for the black document case Rebecca had brought. One by one, I placed every folder inside. Margaret's letter went in last. I closed the lid. The metal latches clicked into place. The black case rested on the passenger seat the entire drive. Daniel glanced at it once before pulling into the parking lot. You don't have to open it unless you decide it's necessary. I know. And you don't have to prove anything to people who refuse to listen. I smiled. I know that too. He reached over and squeezed my hand. No matter what happens in there, you're not walking out alone. That simple sentence settled something inside me. Years ago, I had walked into unfamiliar places wondering if anyone would stand beside me. Not anymore. I stepped out of the car, picked up the black case, and took a slow breath. The family had rented a large banquet room at a local country club. I could already hear laughter before we reached the entrance. Someone had gone all out. Flowers decorated every table. Old family photos played across a projector screen. A large banner stretched across one wall celebrating Susan's birthday. People were hugging, taking pictures, and balancing paper plates filled with cake. It looked like the kind of gathering that pretended nothing difficult had ever happened. The conversation softened for a split second when I walked in. Then the smiles appeared. Natalie. There she is. It's been so long. One cousin hugged me. An aunt patted my shoulder. An uncle commented that I looked exactly the same. It was almost impressive. 20 years of silence had somehow transformed into effortless friendliness. I smiled politely, asked about their children, commented on the decorations, accepted a glass of iced tea. Nothing more. I wasn't cold. I just wasn't pretending we were suddenly close. As people drifted away, I noticed something interesting. Several relatives kept looking toward the black case in my hand. Not openly, just quick glances, then back to my face. One cousin finally laughed. "Business trip after this?" I smiled. "No, just brought a few things." He nodded, though he looked unconvinced. Across the room, Claire noticed me. Our eyes met for only a second. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away this time either. She gave the smallest nod before turning back to another conversation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. And somehow that felt like progress. Daniel stayed close without hovering. He chatted easily with relatives who introduced themselves. No one knew much about him. Most people assumed he was simply my husband, which, for the moment, was exactly what I wanted. No explanations, no speeches, just another guest. Susan, meanwhile, was completely in her element. She moved from table to table, accepting compliments, laughing loudly, posing for photographs, and thanking everyone for coming. If someone had walked into the room without knowing our history, they would have thought she was the center holding the entire family together. She spotted me near the refreshment table. "There you are," her voice carried across the room. She wrapped me in a quick hug before I could react. "I'm so happy you came. It was your invitation. I'm glad you accepted." Her smile never faded, but I noticed her eyes drift toward the black case for the briefest moment. Only a second. Then they were back on me. "What have you got there?" "Oh," I said calmly. "Just something I wanted to bring." She laughed lightly. "You've always been mysterious." I didn't answer. She waited another moment, almost expecting me to explain. When I didn't, she smoothly excused herself to greet another group of guests. Daniel leaned closer. She noticed it. I think everyone has. The room gradually filled until nearly every chair was occupied. Conversations overlapped. Children ran between the tables. Someone started handing out slices of birthday cake. The atmosphere became louder, warmer, more relaxed. Strangely, I felt the opposite. Not nervous, steady. Like I'd finally stopped carrying everyone else's version of my life. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to embarrass anyone. I was there because I refused to disappear again. If you've ever had people define your story before you had the chance to tell it yourself, you probably know how strange that moment feels. Sometimes the hardest part isn't speaking, it's deciding you're no longer afraid to. A spoon tapped gently against a glass. The room quieted. Susan stood near the front beside her birthday cake, smiling as every conversation faded. "I just want to thank all of you for being here today." Applause filled the room. She spoke for another minute about family, memories, and how precious it was to have everyone together again. Then she looked directly at me. Her smile grew even wider. "And since we're finally all reunited," she said brightly, "I think it would be wonderful if Natalie came up and said a few words." Every head in the room turned toward me. For a second, all I could hear was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Susan stood beside her birthday cake, smiling as if she'd just handed me a wonderful opportunity. "Come on," she said. "Everyone would love to hear from you." A few relatives clapped. Someone called out, "Yes, Natalie." Daniel glanced at me but didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The choice was mine. I picked up the black case and walked to the front of the room. Each step felt strangely calm. Not easy. Just settled. Susan handed me the microphone. "I knew you'd have something nice to say." I smiled politely. "I actually wasn't planning to make a speech." A few people laughed softly. I only wanted to ask a couple of questions. The room stayed relaxed. Questions sounded harmless. Susan nodded. Of course. I looked around the room. So many of you have told me today how much you've missed me. Several relatives smiled. That means a lot. I paused. I'm curious, though. When I was sent to live with Uncle Victor, how long did everyone think I was supposed to stay? Aunt Linda answered first. Oh, 6 months, maybe. Across the room, Uncle Brian shook his head. I thought it was closer to a year. One cousin laughed. I always heard you wanted to stay there. Another relative spoke up. I remember being told it was for boarding school. I nodded slowly. Interesting. I looked toward another table. What did you hear? An older cousin shrugged. That your parents gave you more opportunities by sending you away. Someone behind him frowned. I thought Victor volunteered because your parents were overwhelmed. The answers kept coming. None of them matched. Not exactly. Small differences, different explanations, different memories. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was only listening. The room gradually became quieter. People started looking at one another instead of at me. Susan laughed lightly. It was a long time ago. I'm sure we're all remembering things differently. I agree, I said. That's why I wanted to ask. I turned toward my father. Dad. He looked up slowly. Do you remember how long I was supposed to stay? He cleared his throat. It wasn't really planned. Someone near the back looked confused. I thought it was temporary. Another aunt spoke up. I remember Susan saying Natalie would be home before Christmas. Susan's smile stiffened. Plans changed. I nodded again. They must have. Nobody interrupted this time. The silence was becoming heavier than the questions. I asked another one. When was the last time everyone remembers my parents visiting me at Uncle Victor's farm? People glanced around the room. I never went. I thought they visited every month. No, I heard every holiday. Weren't they calling every week? Claire lowered her eyes. She wasn't speaking. She was listening. Carefully. Every answer created another contradiction. I wasn't exposing anyone. They were doing it themselves. Without realizing it, I noticed relatives beginning to whisper. Tiny conversations. That's not what I heard. I could have sworn. Really. The certainty that had filled the room when I arrived was quietly disappearing. Susan stepped closer. Natalie. Her voice stayed pleasant. I don't think this is really the time. I smiled gently. You're probably right. She visibly relaxed. Then I continued. There's just one last question. Nobody moved. I looked around the room once more. Has anyone here ever actually seen the paperwork from that time? Blank faces. A few people slowly shook their heads. I didn't think so. Susan folded her arms. We didn't bring everyone here to discuss old legal documents. No. I nodded. You invited me to a family reunion. And families usually remember the same history. No one answered. I carefully set the microphone on the table beside the birthday cake. Then I placed the black case in front of me. Every pair of eyes followed it. The metal latches reflected the light overhead. I rested both hands on the lid. I spent most of my life believing memories would never matter. I looked briefly toward Claire. Then I learned memories change. The room was completely silent now. So instead of asking anyone to choose between stories, my fingers found the locks. I'd rather start with records. A sharp metallic click echoed through the room, then another. I slowly unlocked the black case. I reached into the black case without rushing. The room had gone so quiet that even the soft sound of the latches opening seemed louder than it should have. No dramatic reveal, just neatly organized folders. I picked up the first stack and handed copies across the table, one person at a time. I made enough for everyone, I said. People looked confused more than anything else. Susan frowned as she flipped through the first page. What is this supposed to be? Read it. That was all I said. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Paper turned. Eyes moved from one line to another. Expressions changed little by little. My father barely glanced at his copy before setting it down. I don't know where you got these. Rebecca finally spoke for the first time since we arrived. I do. Every head turned toward her. She remained standing near the wall, calm and professional. I'm Rebecca Collins. I represented Margaret during the preparation of her estate. Every document distributed today is a certified copy from her protected records. Someone at the end of the table asked quietly, Certified? Rebecca nodded. Each document can be independently verified. The room became noticeably heavier. I watched my aunt compare 2 pages. One contained the temporary guardianship agreement. The other showed the court acknowledgement. She looked back and forth several times before whispering, I didn't even know this existed. Neither did most of them. That much was becoming obvious. Claire kept reading without saying a word. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached another page. She looked up at our parents. Dad. He didn't answer. She tried again. Did you really sign these? Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that grows because nobody knows which lie to protect first. My father finally leaned back in his chair. Legal paperwork doesn't always mean what people think. Rebecca answered before I could. In this case, it does. Her voice stayed perfectly even. The guardianship transferred responsibility for Natalie during that period. The language is very clear. Susan crossed her arms. This is ridiculous. There had to be a reason. There was, I replied. I've never said there wasn't. That caught her off guard. She had been expecting anger. Instead, I sounded almost tired. I opened another folder. This set contains school transfer records. I passed several more copies around. Victor and Helen's names appeared over and over. Emergency contacts, enrollment forms, medical authorizations, transportation approvals, years of signatures, years of responsibility. My mother stared at the pages as though she'd never seen my name attached to anything before. Someone farther down the table asked quietly, If Victor and Helen handled all this, where were you? Nobody answered, because there wasn't a good answer. Claire slowly turned another page. This says tuition assistance was approved. She stopped reading. Her eyes narrowed. I thought Natalie dropped out for a while. I looked at her. I never did. She swallowed. That's what we were told. A cousin spoke up. I remember hearing that too. So do I, another relative added. Small comments started appearing from different sides of the room. I heard something different. I thought she moved because she wanted to. I was told she refused to come home. Every sentence contradicted another. Not because anyone intended to lie in that moment, because they'd all been told different versions over the years. The silence afterward felt even louder. Rebecca carefully lifted another document. This financial summary is included only because it directly relates to Natalie's guardianship. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply pointed to a highlighted section. The funds designated for Natalie's education were transferred according to these records. Several relatives leaned closer. My father's expression changed almost immediately. He recognized the document. I could tell. He reached for his copy but stopped halfway. His jaw tightened. This is getting completely out of context. Rebecca remained composed. Which part? He hesitated. The entire situation. She waited. So you're saying the signatures are inaccurate? No. The dates? No. The court filing? No. He rubbed a hand across his forehead. People are drawing conclusions that aren't fair. For the first time since I arrived, nobody rushed to defend him. Not even Susan. Claire was still reading, very slowly, like every page erased something she'd believed her entire life. I looked around the room. No one was yelling anymore. No one was celebrating Susan's birthday. Nobody even touched the cake. They were simply staring at papers that refused to change no matter how uncomfortable they felt. Then my father finally pushed his chair back. He looked directly at me. "You're making everyone misunderstand what really happened." I didn't answer my father right away. Instead, I reached into the black case one more time. "This," I said quietly, "is the only thing here that isn't a legal document." I held up a single envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable. I'd seen it on birthday cards, Christmas notes, and every letter she had mailed me over the years. Rebecca gave a small nod. "I've already confirmed its authenticity. Margaret wrote it in my office while preparing her estate." I carefully unfolded the pages. "My grandmother didn't write this for court," I said. "She wrote it because she knew one day someone would ask what really happened." No one interrupted. I read only a few lines. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to explain it myself. Natalie, you were never unwanted. Decisions were made around you, not with you. I kept every record because memories can be questioned, documents cannot." The room seemed to shrink. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody whispered. I continued. "One day, people may say they simply forgot, or that events happened differently. That is why I saved every letter, every receipt, every signature. Not to punish anyone, only so the truth would survive longer than I could." I lowered the letter. My voice almost failed me, but I kept going. Rebecca slid another folder toward the center of the table. The financial records referenced in Margaret's letter. She opened it with practiced hands. Inside were bank statements, transfer confirmations, canceled checks. Every page had dates matching the guardianship records. Rebecca pointed to several highlighted entries. Funds intended for Natalie's education and care were withdrawn from the designated account. A relative leaned closer. "Those withdrawals weren't made by Victor or Helen." "No," Rebecca replied. "They weren't." Another silence, a different kind this time. Not confusion, recognition. Claire slowly picked up one of the statements. She compared the signature at the bottom with the guardianship papers already sitting beside her. Her eyes widened. She checked again, then again. "Dad?" He didn't look at her. She swallowed hard. "These are your signatures?" He finally answered. "It isn't that simple." "What isn't?" "I was handling family finances." She frowned. "For whose benefit?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Susan tried stepping in. "Claire, sweetheart, you're looking at paperwork without understanding the circumstances." Claire turned toward her. "Then explain them." Susan hesitated. "It was complicated." "How?" Nobody answered. Claire looked around the table, almost begging someone to make sense of everything. She looked at me next. Not with anger. Not anymore. With confusion. "I thought," she whispered. She couldn't finish. I helped her. "You thought I left." A tiny nod. "I thought you stopped calling." "I didn't. I thought you didn't want anything to do with us." "I wrote letters." She blinked. "What?" "I wrote for almost 2 years." Her face went completely still. "I never got any." "I know." That was the first moment tears appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet disbelief. She looked back toward our parents. Did she really write?" Neither of them answered. Claire's breathing became uneven. "I spent years thinking my sister walked away from us." I shook my head. "I was a kid." The words came out softer than I expected. "I didn't even know where I was allowed to go." Across the table, one of our cousins covered her mouth. and Uncle quietly sat back in his chair. Even relatives who barely knew me avoided looking at my parents now. Margaret's letter remained open in the middle of the table. The handwriting seemed louder than anyone's voice. She waited far longer than any child should have. I hadn't planned to read that sentence aloud. I didn't need to. Everyone could see it. Claire stared at those words for a long time. Then she looked at me again. Years of assumptions seemed to fall away all at once. Not because I had delivered some emotional speech, because every document, every signature, every bank record, and every line Margaret had written pointed in exactly the same direction. For the first time, Claire wasn't trying to decide who to believe. She was trying to accept what the evidence already showed. I hadn't abandoned my family. I had been the one left behind. Nobody spoke. The birthday decorations suddenly looked painfully out of place. Claire slowly pushed back her chair. The sound echoed across the room. Everyone watched her. For a brief second, it seemed like she was about to walk toward our parents. Instead, she turned and took her first step toward me. Claire stopped a few feet in front of me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked exhausted, like someone who had spent the last hour watching her entire childhood rearrange itself. Then she took a slow breath. I'm sorry. Her voice cracked before she could finish. I believed things that weren't true. Nobody moved. Claire wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, clearly frustrated that she was crying. I thought you left us. I told people that. She looked down. I should have asked questions a long time ago. I didn't know what to say. There wasn't a perfect response. You were a kid too, I finally said. You believed what you were told. She nodded, but it didn't seem to make her feel any better. Behind her, my parents remained silent. For the first time in my life, they weren't controlling the story. They couldn't. Every document was still spread across the table. Every signature, every bank record, Margaret's letter. None of it had disappeared because someone wanted it to. My father finally spoke. So, what happens now? His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Rebecca answered before I did. That depends on Natalie. Everyone looked at me again. Susan cleared her throat. If we could just talk privately, maybe we can work something out. I knew exactly what she meant. Some kind of agreement. Some kind of compromise. Maybe even another version of the story. I gently closed the last folder. I'm not signing anything. Susan blinked. I wasn't asking. I know what you're asking. I kept my voice calm. I'm not giving up the inheritance. Nobody argued. I'm also not negotiating what happened. That sentence stayed in the room for several long seconds. I didn't come here for revenge, I continued. I came because I was tired of hearing a version of my life that never actually happened. I looked around the table one last time. You've all seen the records now. Then I pushed every folder toward the center. I didn't need to carry them anymore. The evidence belonged to everyone who had spent years believing something else. Rebecca quietly smiled. Not because anyone had won, because there was nothing left to prove. Daniel met me near the front door. He hadn't interrupted once. He simply held my coat. You okay? He asked softly. I thought about the question. I don't know. He nodded. Fair enough. Outside, the evening air felt strangely quiet. For the first time that day, I could breathe without feeling like I was preparing for another fight. A few seconds later, the front door opened behind us. Claire stepped outside. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know. I'd like to know you. I smiled a little. Then start by calling once in a while. She laughed through the last of her tears. I can do that. We didn't hug. It would have felt forced. Instead, she gave a small wave before walking back inside. It was enough. Months passed. Not everything magically became better. I still never received an apology from my parents. Some relatives avoided me. Others reached out quietly after reading copies of Margaret's letter again. Claire called every few weeks. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes only 5 minutes. We didn't spend every conversation discussing the past. More often, we talked about work, recipes, bad weather, or whatever horse Victor was complaining about that week. It felt normal. And maybe that's what healing actually looks like. Not one emotional conversation, just showing up again and again. The legal process finished exactly as Margaret intended. The house became mine. The investment stayed protected. No one challenged the will. The no contest clause had done its job. Ironically, the inheritance stopped being the most important part of the story. The real victory happened the moment everyone in that room saw the same documents at the same time. After that, no one could honestly repeat the old version as if it were fact. Truth didn't erase the pain, but it finally gave the pain the right name. A few months later, I found the black case sitting in my office. I opened it. Empty. No folders, no letters, no copies waiting to defend my life. I picked it up anyway. It felt surprisingly light. Daniel smiled as he watched me set it by the door. Keeping it? Yeah. For what? I thought for a second before answering. It reminds me that I don't have to carry all of that anymore. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Maybe he did. I switched off the office light, picked up the case, and walked outside. For years it had carried evidence. Now, it carried closure. And before this story ends, I'd really like to hear from you. If you discovered that your family had built an entire story about you that wasn't true, would you have done what I did? Or would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments.